Hello, this is Pastor Laura Cavendish from St. Paul Lutheran in Asheville, and I'm here with Mary Ann Weibel, and we are the ones who are going to read to you chapter 3 of Making Sense of the Cross. This chapter is entitled Ransom and Victory, and Mary Ann will begin for us.
I'm intrigued, Pastor, by something you just said.
What's that?
Well, you talked about the difference between how the Gospels describe the passion of Jesus and how later theologians interpret it. Can you say a little more?
Sure. The 4 Gospels are all stories, accounts of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. They were written to help order and make sense of all the various stories of Jesus that were floating around at the time. The writers wanted to help people to believe that Jesus is the Messiah and also to understand what their belief means for their lives, given their immediate challenges and concerns. As a big part of that, they describe the events leading to Jesus' arrest and crucifixion and the report of his resurrection. They aren't just descriptions, of course. They are themselves interpretations, as each of them tells the story in a particular way to make a particular point and speak to the concerns of a particular community.
Well, you said they offered different portraits to voice different perspectives or confessions of what Jesus' death and resurrection mean.
Right, but those interpretations are lodged in the descriptions themselves. Whatever else the Gospels are or do, they remain stories about Jesus. In other words, none of the Gospels narrates parts of Jesus' life and then stops and has the author interpret it. Now, the reason Jesus told the parable of the prodigal son is so that we would understand that God is like a patient parent, always willing to wait for wayward children to return.
That would kind of ruin the story, I suspect, like when you have to explain the punchline of a joke.
Exactly. Stories are effective precisely because they don't tell you everything. They give enough details for you to follow the narrative trail the author has set, but also leave enough gaps that require you to fill them in with your imagination and figure some things out for yourself. We care about stories because we enter into them imaginatively and make them our own.
I wonder if that's why whenever a favorite book is made into a movie, the movie never quite seems to do the book justice.
I think you're probably right. You filled in the gaps differently than the screenwriters and actors and director.
So when Harry Potter was made into a movie, for instance, I remember thinking they got Ron just right, but I didn't imagine Hermione to look the way she did at all.
I had the same reaction.
It's not that their vision is wrong. In fact, I love the way Emma Watson has brought Hermione to life. It's just what I'd imagined while reading the book.
I know what you mean. A good book not only gets you to fill in the gaps with your imagination, but also gets you invested in the way you've imagined something. Ultimately, I think it's a mark of just how effective J.K. Rowling, or any author for that matter, is at engaging your imagination in the first place.
And we saw that in the Gospels, too, that they were told some details but left others for you to fill in and figure out and wonder about.
That's right. So while the Gospels describe the cross, and while those descriptions certainly offer confessions about what the cross means, those confessions are implicit or contained within the context of each story. Later, theologians interpret the stories and make new confessions. They try to explain, make explicit, the meaning of the cross outside the context of the gospel stories.
But can you do that? I mean, can you ever really explain a good story without ruining it?
That's a great question, one we may want to return to from time to time. For now, I think it's probably safe to say that you can't ever fully explain any great story. Ultimately, stories are something to be experienced more than explained. But I also think it makes sense to want to explain some details about them. That's what the study of literature is in many ways, as well as all the discussion boards and fan blogs we have today about great books and movies. Attempts to get beneath the story so that we can understand and enjoy the story even more.
And that's what theologians try to do with their stories of the cross.
Right, they want to get underneath them and explain them because they believe the Bible is not just another story, but the story that tells us most truly who we are and what purpose our lives may have. Theologians want to open it up and explain the story enough so that we can enter into it and thereby encounter God. And because the cross stands at the center of this story, they give particular attention to helping us understand it.
That's challenging enough for a single story. Doesn't having 4 gospels complicate things a little?
Actually, it complicates things a lot. And don't forget about the rest of the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, for instance, had a lot to say about the cross, and several of the other New Testament letters are important too.
I'd forgotten about that. That means that there are a lot of details and ideas about the cross to keep in mind.
That's probably why there have been so many different attempts to make sense of the cross over the centuries. That's also why we'll need to pay attention to the choices different theologians make.
What do you mean?
Remember our discussion of the different gospel stories of the Passion? The gospel writers focused on different details to tell their stories. And when you have 4 different accounts, there are enough different distinct details that no one theory can explain them all. So the theologians had to make choices, emphasizing some details while leaving out others. At the same time, the theologians tended to draw on imagery from their own time and place to create their theories. And they responded to the questions they and their contemporaries had.
Like the gospel writers themselves did?
Very much so. And to tell you the truth, like we do.
How so?
Well, we also are not only interested in what happened with Mark's community that shaped that gospel, but are also interested in how his gospel speaks to us today. And that's what these theologians were doing too, even if they didn't always realize it. They were interpreting the biblical witness in light of their questions and circumstances, so that the message of the cross would speak to their own time and people.
But if we all have different interpretations, how can you tell which one is right, at least the best one?
Well, if you get into a discussion with a friend about the meaning of the sacrifice Harry Potter's mother made for him, and you each propose an explanation, how do you finally decide which one is right?
Well, first you look at the story. You see if the idea or theory explains the important details.
Right, and it will be important for us to do that with these theories as well.
But like we just said, with so many details, no one theory can explain them all.
Is that really all that different then when dealing with a book like Harry Potter? After all, even though there is a single author, there are 7 books in that series and countless references to his mom's sacrifice. And then there are the movies, which are also interpretations of the books and involve screenwriters, directors, actors, and the rest. We also probably have those in mind when we're talking about the meaning of his mom's sacrifice.
I see what you mean. Details alone don't do it. I guess you end up going with the explanation that feels right to you.
Can you say a little more about that?
I'm not sure I can. I mean, it's hard to explain. Sometimes one explanation just seems more right to you. You might not even agree with the people you're talking with, and you finally can't prove your point, but I guess the explanation you go with is the one that explains things best for you, the one that helps you understand the story best.
I know what you mean, and that's going to be very true with the theories about the cross we're going to discuss too. which will be good to remember.
What do you mean?
Some Christians have tended to make the way they understand the cross the absolute and only way any good Christian can understand the cross. And I think that's a mistake.
Why?
Because as we just said, the best stories are those that can only be experienced. They can't be fully explained. Various interpretations of the cross are helpful, but no single one of them fully exhausts the potential for the passion narrative to have an effect on people, to move them to faith in the God made known through Jesus.
So when you choose only one and say all the rest are wrong, then you're limiting the power of the gospel stories to represent God in the fullest way possible. And in this way, we really affect people.
Exactly. As we saw with the Gospels, you might find one way of understanding the cross particularly helpful at one time in your life or during one set of circumstances. But at another time, or while facing other challenges, you might find another way of understanding the cross helpful.
I think I see what you mean. But does that mean any explanation about the cross is valid?
No, there have been lots of different interpretations of the cross over the centuries, and some have definitely been better than others.
Well, how do you decide which one is better?
Well, Christians have determined which explanations are worth hanging on to by first asking how well any interpretation makes sense of the various details about the cross in the gospel stories. And second, Christians look at how well an interpretation makes sense of our life in the world. We'll look at three main ways Christians have interpreted the cross. In my opinion, none of them is the only way to understand the cross, and we'll want to ask critical questions about each one. Nevertheless, each view has proven very helpful to Christians at different times. It may still be helpful to us today, depending on our circumstances.
You mentioned that some time ago there were several. What did you call them?
Theories of atonement.
Yeah, that was it.
You could call them models, systems, or even points of view. I chose theories because it reminds us that the theologians proposing them really were trying to figure things out and make sense of the cross.
Got it. But what about atonement? Could you say a little more about that?
Sure, atonement actually means just what it says. It's concerned with the question of how you repair or restore something that is broken. So quite literally, it means to be at one or in accord with someone or at one-ment. So when you make atonement for something, you are doing something to repair a broken relationship.
And that's the question with the cross, how Jesus' death repairs our broken relationship with God.
That's right, which gives us some clues about what to pay attention to.
What do you mean?
If you're going to fix something, you need to know what's broken, what the problem is. So each theory of atonement will have something to say about what's gone wrong, what the human problem or predicament is. And of course, we'll also want to know what's needed to fix it, what's necessary to restore things. In this case, that's asking about Jesus, why his cross was necessary, and how it achieved atonement.
So, one of the things we'll look for in thinking through these theories is their understanding of what's gone wrong, and second, how to fix it.
Right. And because atonement is about restoring a relationship, we'll also want to see what each theory of atonement says about the two participants in the relationship, God and humanity. We'll discover a lot about what the theory says about us when we talk about what's broken, but we'll also want to pay close attention to what each theory or model says about the God who is, about what kind of God is at work in and through the cross.
Okay, so we'll ask what each theory says about God. That makes three things to pay attention to. Is there anything else?
The last thing will be to ask what picture or understanding of the Christian life each theory gives.
I'm not sure I understand.
Once you have a sense of what's gone wrong and what is needed to fix it, then you should also have a pretty good idea of the kind of life that will support the new repaired relationship. That is, if we were talking about an everyday relationship like the kind we have with friends, we might diagnose the problem as poor communication and then recommend that these friends set aside time to talk to each other. Or maybe the problem is that each of them is holding on to some resentment about what the other did a long time ago. And so you not only need to get those issues on the table and deal with them, you also need to commit to talking about things that bother you in the future so that you don't allow resentment to build up again.
I think I see what you mean.
When it comes to Christian faith, the questions become, what kind of life do Christians lead in light of the problems they identified and the solutions proposed? What picture of our life in faith with God and with each other does each model propose?
Okay, I think I've got it. We're going to pay attention to 4 things as we think through each theory of atonement and try to make sense of the cross. Each is essentially trying to answer a question. What's broken about the relationship between God and humanity? 2, how does Jesus' cross repair what's broken? How, that is, does atonement happen? 3, what is God like? And 4, what picture of the Christian life does each theory give us?
That's where we will end for today. And I messed up our ending. Oh, I can't fix that, though, for those of you who are listening. We're going to end here for today, and we'll be back for day 2 in 2 days.